Hello. Yes. Welcome everybody to Timbro. My name is Lydia Walsen and I am program manager here for growth and environmental issues. As you know, we have some guests here from across the Atlantic today. Pierre Desrochers and Hiroko Shimizu. And they have written a great book called A Hipster's Dilemma, and it's on local food production. Pierre and Hiroko have looked at the economics of food geography, and it's a fascinating story that they are telling in the book. Pierre Desrochers is Associate Professor of Geography at the University of Toronto. He has written extensively on the interplay between free markets and environment for many years, and he has published over 40 peer-reviewed articles on topics ranging from economic development and globalization to energy and transportation. Hiroko Shimizu, who is there, you can wave to the audience. She's a trained economist and holds a master's degree in public policy from Osaka University. She has worked at numerous academic institutions and businesses in Japan, Canada, the States, and China. They have both been fellows at PERC, which is a free market environmentalist institute in Montana, and the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. And with that, I would like to give the word to Maria Suner Fleming, who is Director for Energy and Climate Issues at the Confederation of Swedish Enterprise, and she will be our moderator this evening. So, Maria?
Thank you very much. My mic is functioning, very good. I'm very glad to be here today and to be moderating this event about this very interesting book. It's a book that gives a perspective on the myth of food production and food chains from an environmental and social perspective. So it's going to be very interesting to hear more about the book in a short minute. The evening will be organized that first the authors will present their book for about 20 to 25 minutes, and then we will have two commentators who will comment the book and give some perspective to the debate and also to the Swedish debate. First, we will have Fredrik Torehammar, who comes from the Swedish Food Federation. The Food Federation is representing about 800 food-producing companies in Sweden. Actually, I learned just recently today that it's the fourth biggest industrial sector in Sweden, employing 57,000 people. So it's a pretty big sector for Sweden. And then we will have Linus Kjellander, who is over there. He comes from a think tank called dyrare.mat.nu, which is a part of a global campaign called Pay the Price. And actually it started as a Facebook group, I think, but you will tell us more about that. And I also know about you that you have grown up in an ecological farm, actually, which I know you will tell us something about. But first, actually, I'm going to present a short, what do you call it in English, a poll that's very new. I think it's from today, Lydia, yes?
No, it's another file. It's another file.
Could we change the to the other?
Yeah.
Fel presentation. Ja, jag skulle presentera undersökningen. Ja. Nej. Här. Exactly. This is actually a poll made very recently by Demoscope, showing what the Swedes think about locally produced food. Is it important or is it not important? This actually shows very clearly that I would say a majority thinks that this is important if you ask the overarching question. Very important or fairly important is a majority of the Swedes, actually. We can also see that there are political dimensions to this. The Green Party, the Social Democrats, and the Center Party, they are more in favor of locally produced food than other parties. Maybe not surprising. And we also think, as Swedes, that locally produced food is better for the environment and our economy, which is something that I know that our authors will tell us all about. So it would be interesting to hear your comments to what the Swedes think on this. I don't think it's a very huge difference, but there's a small difference that women think that this is more important than men, actually. And the last slide, actually, I was actually pretty amazed that there was such a big majority, or not big majority, but they knew that the production caused more emissions than the transportation of food. I was surprised to hear that was so commonly known. So this is some perspectives to start with, which I hope also that you could comment on in your presentation. And just as a very brief note before I leave the floor over to you, Pierre, is the word hipster, which is used for the Swedish translation about the book. Actually, the English translation is a locavore. I don't know if you're going to elaborate a bit more on what a locavore is,
yes,
but that we don't have a Swedish word for that really, but that is a person who is very concerned about eating locally produced food. And I think it's a movement that started in the United States, actually, or in Canada. So with those words, I will leave the floor to you, Pierre.
Well, thank you very much.
And now we have the right.
Okay. Thank you. Well, thank you very much, and thank you for being here so numerous tonight. So, as you can probably guess by my accent, yes, I'm Canadian, but I'm obviously French-Canadian, and I only became somewhat fluent in English at the age of 19. I grew up in a very traditional French-speaking portion of Quebec, a small rural town. There were about 800 people in the town where I grew up. Most of my neighbors were farmers. My parents had other jobs, but we had a small apple orchard, about 52 apple trees, a small sugar shack operation. And if you were wondering, well, sugar in Canada, isn't it like Sweden? Well, we're talking maple syrup, of course. And we kept also backyard chickens before it was popular. Actually, we kept that for 3 days because we had a little terrier dog who would not let us eat them. He ate them before we did. So then we switched over to rabbits. But my brother and I, when we were about that big, we wouldn't eat our own rabbits. So we would trade them with the neighbor's rabbits. And so we would eat the neighbor's rabbit around Christmas or something. And then, later on, I worked for the Quebec Farmers Union. I even, at one point, considered writing a master's thesis on the Canada-United States trade dispute regarding the export of pork. But then I gave up, and I was like in my early 20s, like everybody else in my part of Quebec who grew up on a farm or in that area. None of my colleagues, none of the people I went to class with are actually in farming anymore, except one who sells tractors and farming equipment. And what has happened in that town, as has happened in many other places, and perhaps in Sweden too, is that a new generation of young idealists from the suburbs have moved in and are trying to promote food targeted at urban citizens who believe the same thing that people in Sweden believe, that local food is better for the environment, that it is more nutritious, that it is good for economic development. Now, like many of you, I probably first heard these claims many years ago, and I was not going to do anything about it. I mean, I knew a little bit about transportation and other things, but it's really Hiroko, my wife, who sort of whipped me into writing something about that, because what happened is that 6 years ago, almost to this date, my department, the geography department at my campus of the University of Toronto, invited a prominent Canadian academic who told us, among other things, the virtues of local food, but he took it one step further. I think he was kind of more consistent than many other local food advocates. He went as far as stating that people who live beyond their local food shed are essentially parasites because they take more from the earth than they give back. And then he came up with a map and some data, and he said, well, look at my map and my data. Obviously, the most parasitical people in the world are the Japanese. Now, Hiroko, as you can guess, kind of looks Japanese, and she's a real Japanese. She was born and raised in Tokyo. So I made the mistake of bringing her to that conference that evening. So you imagine all my colleagues are there, like 200 people, and she goes like, and so I did not let her speak her mind in front of my colleagues that evening, but I promised her that we would try to bring some truth in advertising to this debate. And this is really what the book is about. We don't pretend to say anything that hasn't been said by other people before. I mean, people have written about food policy for thousands of years. I mean, everyone from Plato to Michael Pollan today. I mean, a lot of people have had opinions about food, but we tried to come up with an approach which we believe at least looks at the data rather than how people feel about food. And so the book is really an attempt to synthesize a lot of information, and we share a few beliefs in common, which was good because we had our disagreements writing the book. But you know, a molecule is a molecule, and paying more for food is not something that about 2 billion people can do under any circumstances, and a lot of other people are trying to stretch their budget. So we have a few preconceptions. At least we had a few preconceptions when we wrote the book, and they will be kind of obvious in the slides that I will show you, but I will also be happy to expand on them during the question period. So do you want me to stay here? Is that good? Okay. So in essence, what I want to tell you a little bit about is the history of the local food movement, not just the recent local food movement, but essentially to tell you that the modern local food movement is as old as long-distance transportation. It seems to come back every generation, yet it never sticks. And why is that? And then I'll try to tell you why the main arguments that are put forward by locavores or hipsters do not stand up to scrutiny. Okay, so again, in English, the original title of the book was The Locavore Dilemma. It actually started in the United Kingdom, so we have the Brits to thank for that. But the word locavore was coined by an American. So herbivores eat plants, carnivores eat meat, locavores eat local. But we all still live on the same planet, right? It's not like we import food from outer space. So obviously, good quality food has to be produced somewhere, typically close to where other people will be living. So at different times of the year and in different locations, all of us will eat local food. So obviously, the movement has to be beyond that. And what a locavore really stands for, we argue, is cutting down on food imports from other locations and increasing local food production at the expense of food imports. Otherwise, the movement would not make any sense. I mean, we will all consume Swedish strawberries when they're in season, rather than try to have them grown in greenhouses in New Zealand and bring them over here. I mean, that just wouldn't make any sense. But the movement today is about much more than just food. And it's really a reaction against globalization, against agribusiness. And so these are a few things that I took from the web. I mean, I'm really not good at Photoshop or creating nice things, so trust me, I did not create those. So there's one to the left here, occupy the food supply and corporate exploitation of our food system. And in our society, growing food is now the most radical thing you can do. Now, that would probably not tell you anything, but I was born in a time in Quebec where young radical used to blow up, mailboxes in the English parts of Montreal. French-Canadian nationalism was very strong at one point in time. So if that's the word, if growing a garden is the worst thing that young radicals will do today, I'm kind of okay with that. So one point we make in the book, though, is that there used to be plenty of local food before there was a local food movement. I don't know if you can see that in the back, but this is a picture taken in Paris in the late 19th century, probably 1870, 1880. And at the time, about 1/6 of the greater area of Paris is devoted to food production. So as I hope you can see here in the back, okay, good, this works. There's a tree without any leaves. This is obviously the winter in Paris. You can see a wall which surround this garden, and all those gardens in Paris were surrounded by a wall to create a microclimate, get a few extra degrees. And what people are doing here is that they're basically trucking produce, vegetables to Paris and bringing back horse manure. This is before cars come along. So they grow a lot of vegetable in horse manures under cloche to create extra heat in the winter. And in order, when this is not enough, then they put dark straw mat to attract more sunlight to again create more heat to be able to grow things. They grow asparagus year-round, they grow tomatoes year-round. By the late 19th century, those people even grow pineapples in the Paris area. Of course, they're outrageously expensive, but these people are able to achieve much. And most of the fresh produce that people consume in Paris is produced near Paris. And yet, in the late 19th century, the whole system falls apart. Basically, what happens, horses disappear, there's less horse manure available, but more importantly, the railroad is able to connect Paris to Italy and the Mediterranean, where nature provides you with heat free of charge. And in the high season there, these people are working 17 to 18 hours a day. And a lot of it is related to making sure that you don't have too much heat on your vegetable, or else that they don't freeze at night. And when nature provides you better condition, why would you keep that lifestyle? So they don't. And the whole local food system of Paris, which is extremely sophisticated, I'm sure there was one in Stockholm too, disappears very quickly at the time because of produce coming in from the Mediterranean. Now, I was asked to try to find a Swedish link to my talk. That's the closest I can get Minneapolis in the United States. As you know, most of the Swedes in the US ended up in that part of the US. So Minneapolis has a climate which is more similar to Stockholm than Paris, and this is a big greenhouse operation that supplies cucumbers to Minneapolis a century ago. Again, Minneapolis, trust me, I've been there in the winter. It's not prime location to grow cucumbers year-round, but they're able to do it. So there was a sophisticated local food system even in Minneapolis. So the first question we ask in the book is a very simple one. Well, you know, if things were so great when most of the food supply in most places, most of the time was local, what happened? Why did people work so hard to develop the globalized food supply chain in the first place? And then another question that we look at is that, as I was telling you, there have been a number of local food movements over the last 2 centuries. This is my favorite illustration here. I don't know, again, if you can see that in the back. So this is from World War II in the United Kingdom. Use spades, not ship. So as you know, at the time, there are a lot of U-boats in the North Atlantic. There's killing the British merchant marine fleet. And so there is, of course, a big push to grow more food in the United Kingdom than was the case before the war. So grow your own food and supply your own cookhouse. But because of war, because of economic downturns, because people don't like the railroad companies, because people believe that kids don't know how the food is grown anymore, these movements keep reappearing and disappearing. So this is from 1 century ago in the United States. There was a big movement because a lot of people were moving from the countryside to the city. And a lot of people believe, well, kids don't know how food is grown anymore. They believe that food appears magically. So a number of schoolyard gardens are created in the United States, and you have important books that promote that. So the two most important one is called Children's Gardens for School and Home, a Manual of Cooperative Gardening, 1904. Another one, 1910, Among School Gardens. You know, get kids to know how food is produced. Otherwise, they're so disconnected now, we cannot go ahead. So United States Department of Agriculture. So the US finally enters the First World War in 1917. Canada has been fighting for 3 years at the time. I'll always remind Americans of that. Make backyards and vacant lot productives, work a garden, raise chickens, grow vegetables and fruit. Somebody has to raise or pack what you eat, do your share. So wartime. But then what happens in the United States? Agricultural production is ramped up tremendously in Europe, in the United States, because not in Sweden, obviously, but elsewhere in Europe, people are busy killing each other and destroying their infrastructure. So at the end of the First World War, the United States is left with a huge agricultural surplus. And this is an attempt in Pennsylvania in 1924 to promote local food in order to deal with that surplus. So it was from the Pennsylvania Agricultural Extension Service, adjusting production to meet market demand in Blair County, Pennsylvania. Altoona, it's kind of a depressing part of Pennsylvania, but there's a lot of fracking around there today, so it's kind of prosperous. But you see the point there. The idea is that, well, we should produce local food for local people to create jobs, 1924. My favorite local food movement of all time, though, is something called the Empire Marketing Board. It was launched in the United Kingdom in the 1920s, and in that case, local is defined as the whole of the British Empire. In case you think I'm making that up, that's another illustration here. The empire is the best market for British skill and industry. Keep your money in the empire. Buy local. Who's to argue against that, right? I mean, what is local, really? But then there's also a dark side to the local food movement, which is never really mentioned by people. Well, maybe things are different in Sweden, but this is from fascist Italy in the 1920s. So when Mussolini takes over, one of his first policies is to cut the dependence of what he called Italian slavery, because Italians at the time were importing a lot of wheat from other parts of Europe and North America and Argentina. So he launches what is called La Battaglia del Grano. Well, I'm French, so I can sort of read Italian here if you don't. Basically, he's calling for more autarky, for the food autarky of our country, so per l'autarchia alimentare del nostro paese, and that's Mussolini himself here, you know, macho, whatever, trying to promote the wheat harvest, and he will succeed. Italy will become self-sufficient in terms of cutting wheat imports, But it will be a disaster for the Italian economy because obviously if the Italians were importing wheat, it's because they were not very good at producing it. So they will plant their citrus orchards, their olive trees, but they will become self-sufficient in food. And so many other bad people historically have also promoted local food. So, but why is it then that these movements keep disappearing? Well, the case we make in the book is that none of the claims that are made by local food activists really can withstand scrutiny. So the first one is that we don't know who produces our food anymore. If we create more local connections, then our communities will be better off as a result. But then you go back in time and you see, well, what were people saying when they were buying local food from local people? Basically, they said, you cannot trust anyone. So this is a book from 1820 by a German chemist who moved to the United Kingdom. I need to read this for you here. So a treatise on the adulteration of food and culinary poison, exhibiting the fraudulent sophistication, that means adulteration, of bread, beer, wine, spirituous liquor, tea, coffee, cream, confectionery, vinegar, mustard, pepper, cheese, oil, pickles, and other articles employed in domestic economy. So basically, you cannot buy the food. You cannot trust the food that you buy locally because, you know, people will put rice powder in cream. They will add water to wine. And you know what? Horse meat to beef. Complaining about that in the early 19th century. I'm just saying. So, and he says this is widespread across all the United Kingdom. And people tend to forget why we have brands today. Well, brands emerge to create trust between people who produce the food and people who buy the food. Because whatever brand you're buying, you're always getting the same thing. When you buy food at the local market, you have problems. Like, for example, in California, you realize that in many local markets, the only local character of the food that is sold there is that it was bought at the local Costco or whatever it would be here, a great, you know, supermarket chain. And so there's really an incentive for large brands to tell their customers exactly what they have, because especially in the United States, a number of lawyers will go after them in no time if something bad happens. So what we point out is that obviously nobody would import food from further away if it was less expensive, if it was a better deal. So I already concede a point to one of my opponents tonight. Local food will be more expensive. How is that good for poorer people? And again, improving social trust. Inconvenient pickup locations and times, especially in community-supported agriculture, and no flexibility. So what happens in the United States? I assume you have that in Sweden too. You know, you make a deal with a farmer, you pay in advance, and you get food delivered throughout the summer. But what happens if for some reason you're able to get rid of your kids for 3 weeks in the summer? You know, you send them to a camp or visit Aunt Gertrude in some other country. Then, you know, you're still getting all that food for 4 or 5 people instead of 2. Or what if you have guests? Then you don't have enough food, so you need to go to the supermarket. And so these arrangements always end up costing a lot of money, or else leading to a lot of waste. I mean, the compost pile of people who engage in community-supported agriculture is always very prosperous. So the result, people have less money and then less time to create other forms of social capital. You have less time to coach Little League soccer, for example, or football, whatever you call it here. Or let's say hockey. Okay, we'll understand Canadian, Swedish. You have less time to coach Little League hockey if you have less money and less time to do other things because you're spending more on food. So how is that good? Then if you pay more for your food, then you have less money to spend on other things. So obviously you end up destroying more jobs than you create. So again, we expand on that in the book, but if you pay more for your food, then you will destroy other jobs because you have less money to spend on other things. Another point we make in the book, I'm an economic geographer, so basically there's never been any sustained period of prosperity in human history without cities. Cities are essential for lifting people out of poverty, they make people more productive, but ever since Plato, and we quote Plato in the book, it's been impossible to feed a large city only on a local basis. So if you take locavorism seriously, you've got to shrink down the size of cities. And we point out that, you know, this is a one-way route to poverty. And then what about less developed countries' exporters? I mean, the local food movement is all about poor people as long as they live close to you. But what about even poorer people elsewhere whose only way out of poverty is to actually export food to people who have more money than them? Economies of scale and transformation. There are such things as economies of scale in food. The bigger you are, the most efficient you are, the more wealth you create out of resources. Sustainability, food miles. So the basic idea of food miles, why would you import things from very far away? I don't know if you can see that island in the back here. It has a palm tree right next to an apple tree. I'm a geographer. I don't know where to find that island. I'm still looking for it. You let me know if you find it. Versus having an apple that falls directly from the tree without any intermediary on your plate. How isn't that good? How isn't that a good thing? Well, the problem with the food mile argument is that it only really works when everything else is equal. But I justify my job as a geographer by saying, you know, people, the world is not the same. Some people are just better at producing food than others because they have better conditions. So this is from a fairly detailed study that compared the productivity of New Zealand and British agriculture, you know, two maritime islands. But given the same amount of resources, the New Zealanders are able to produce 3 times more apples than their British competitors, 4 times more lamb, and 2 times more milk solid. So even if Britain and New Zealand might look superficially the same, they're not. The pasture land in New Zealand, for example, is much better than the pasture land in the UK, so you don't need to give as much supplemental feed to your animals, which is why they're so good at producing milk. You know, God created a good place in the world to produce milk, and it's New Zealand. I know you produce milk in Sweden, we do too in Canada, but let's face it, they're the best. So if there's any New Zealand person in the room, you can thank me later. Then transportation modes. Well, putting a lot of New Zealand apple on a container ship like this and shipping them to North America would cost you about 1 cent per apple delivered. You know, a container ship floats on water, it has huge and highly efficient diesel engine. It requires almost no energy to move things, you know, a third of the way around the world. By contrast, you go to your supermarket, you put a few local apples in the back of your pickup, you bring that home. Just driving like 30 or 40 kilometers might be the same per apples as bringing a whole boatload of apples from New Zealand to North America. So the mode of transportation matters a lot. And then there are such things as season. You know, Canada and Sweden are in the northern hemisphere. Your winter is our winter. Your summer is our summer. They're too short, both, by the way. But in New Zealand, they're in the southern hemisphere. So their summer is our winter, and vice versa. So what happens, for example, for apple production, where I grew up, we pick them mostly in September. You want to eat them in March or April, well, you need to leave them in cold storage for several months. There's a huge energy expenditure associated with that. You will lose some of them to spoilage. By contrast, some apples are picked in March or April in New Zealand. You put them on a container ship. They reach North America a few weeks later. It's better for consumers. The apples are fresher. They're cheaper. And it's better for the environment, too. But the things work both ways. People tend to forget that at certain times of the year, and the kiwis you will find in New Zealand are produced in Italy. Because it makes sense to ship produce from the northern hemisphere to the southern hemisphere at certain times of the year. So this thing works both ways, which is one thing that people tend to forget. So overall, long-distance transportation in the United States is about 4% of the environmental impact. 83% is production, so eating greenhouses, irrigation water, supplemental feed to animals. So even if you're able somehow to cut on transportation, you more than make it in terms of a loss or more damage to the environment by needing more heat, for example, natural gas to heat your greenhouse. I'll go quickly over this. This is the evolution of the forest cover in the United States, 1620, 1850, 1920. So the dark spot here is what the forest cover looked like in the 1920 in the United States. This is what it looks like today. By concentrating food production in the best locations the world over, a lot of marginal agricultural land was abandoned and the forest grew back. The case we make in the book, you love nature, stay away from it. Concentrate food production in the best location and you will need less land overall, and nature will thank you for that. Food security. Aren't putting all our agricultural egg in one monoculture a really terrible thing? What about the Irish potato famine? You know, shouldn't we have more local, diversified food? Yeah, but then think of it this way. Locavores are telling you to put all your production eggs in one regional basket. And you will have droughts, you will have flood. Hiroko is from Japan. You'll even have tsunami, as you might have heard of. And then you're kind of screwed because 2 bad harvests in a row and you have a famine. Historically, famines only disappeared with the advent of the steamship and the railroad in the 19th century because wherever you are in the world, you might have good years in your regions, but then a drought the next. So basically what long-distance transportation does, think of it as a giant insurance policy for humanity. Some people will always have good years, others will have bad years. A few years down the road, the people that had bad years might have good years. So we spread the risk and we send the surplus from regions that have had good years to regions that have had bad years. And we're much more food secure that way. In terms of nutrition and safety, so the basic argument of locavore, local is fresher, therefore it's tastier and more nutritious. In real life, it's kind of more complicated than that. How the food is preserved matters more. But suffice it to say here that if you believe that fresher is better, then local food cannot win. Because in a place like Sweden or Canada, local food will only be fresh a few weeks each year. Whereas our system will give you fresh food from New Zealand, Brazil, the United States, other parts of the year round. So if fresher is the key, then local food cannot win. What about, I don't know if you can see that in the back, importing things from China. Can you trust the funny chemicals and mystery proteins that the Chinese will sometimes send you? Well, keep in mind you're not buying directly from the Chinese, but from supermarkets and wholesalers who have no interest in poisoning their customers. Okay, it's not a winning business strategy. So they have a lot of people checking the food quality between you and the Chinese producer. But there are also the real food safety issues are things like Campylobacter, Salmonella, and E. coli. We're surrounded by all sorts of bad stuff around us. And there are such things, again, as economies of scale in food safety. So if you look at the data, rather than the locavore rhetoric, our food supply is by far the safest in history. Okay, I'm done. Just bear with me. How many of you have seen 300? And you're Swedish, you saw it in English, right? So you know that among other problems with the movie is that King Leonidas of Sparta has a Scottish accent. But that's kind of the least problematic aspect of this image. The first is that the body armor is all wrong, but I always throw that for the women and some men in the audience who appreciate seeing Gerald Butler at this point. But more importantly, this is a variety of wheat that did not exist over 2,000 years ago. But the real anachronistic thing here is Gerald Butler and the Spartan themselves. So if you've seen the movie, you know that Butler is about average height in that movie. All the other Spartans are about his size. Okay, in real life, Gerald Butler is 6'3". The real Spartan back in the day was 5'3". Local diet, global diet. See, if everything is killing us, this is the average American in 1850. That's the average American today. Like me, he has access to too much affordable, cheap food here. But we're taller, healthier, we live longer than we ever had. So if everything is killing us, what gives? So locavorism, Hiroko and I argue, delivers higher costs and greater poverty, no environmental and social benefit, less food security and nutrition than would otherwise be the case, significant penalty to developing economies. So the problem of our food system is not that it is too globalized, but rather that it is not globalized enough. We still have production subsidies, barriers to trade. These are the real issues that well-meaning food activists should address. Local food is just a distraction. Thank you.
Pierre, just
Yes.
1 second. Thank you very much for this very interesting and a bit provocative, I guess, presentation. But I have to ask you one question. If this is this is a niche market for local food that
Yes.
is actually growing in some parts of the world, and people are prepared to pay more for this.
And
Is it a problem? I mean,
No, it's not
would you like to forbid it or?
No. First of all, I would like some truth in advertising. If you're going to buy local food, make sure that you understand that, again, you're doing it maybe because you like the taste, in which case the local food doesn't need a local food movement, but you're not helping the earth. If you pay more for the same or lesser quality, you're not helping the earth, you're not helping your local economy. And on top of that, the problem, I don't know if this is the case in Sweden, but in Canada and the United States, local food activists are constantly pressuring government to force school boards, military bases, and others to source local food more than they did in the past. So, for example, in Toronto now, you have school boards who have to spend more on food, so they have less money to, renovate the gym or provide other activities to the kids. And I have a problem because they're forcing that down the throat of parents or school boards that don't have a lot of money to begin with. So if it is done voluntarily, if people spend their own money, I don't have a problem with it. But increasingly, the movement is becoming coercive, and you see a larger number of local food activists who are against trade liberalization in the agricultural sector. They're now promoting food sovereignty. Even my own province of Quebec, to my shame, has launched its food sovereignty policy a couple of weeks ago. In Quebec now, people produce about a third of what they consume. The government wants to bring that up to 50%. But at the same time, they don't want to stop exporting. They want Quebec producers to export more, but they want to protect their local market more. And, at some point, something has to give. And we think the world would be a better place if people bought local food because it's the best thing that they could buy, irrespective of where it is produced. So no, I'm not against people buying local food, because again, we live on the same planet, and good quality food will have to be produced somewhere. And if it is in your backyard, then so be it. But there are a number of fallacies that come with that, which we thought needed to be addressed.
Okay, thank you. I know that the time is passing, so I think we move on to the commentators. And first is Fredrik Torehammar.
Thank you. A few hours ago, I met a nice person who is close to the Swedish farmers lobby. And he knew about this book, and knew that it was translated. He knew about the contents, and I told him that I was to comment it. And he also knew why you've written it. And I said, why? Because they're Canadian. Do you know how much surplus there is right now in the Canadian agriculture sector?
Yes.
They need to have this campaign going on for food trade. So nice to be here to comment on this book. I appreciate it very much. I recommend anyone to interested in food to read it. I've been asked to give a Swedish view on the food debate and try to link that to some of the contents of your book. The reason for the Swedish title of this book, so Hipster's Dilemma, is obvious for most people in here. There is a part of in Stockholm called Hornstull. Hornstull, biggest idol, if parts of cities do have idols, would be Williamsburg in Brooklyn or maybe somewhere in the Portland, Seattle area. The latest Hornstull invention is this. It's a beer brewed with honey from bees kept in a nearby park. So this drink combines local ingredients with a Viking old method of brewing alcoholic beverages with honey. I don't know what about the hops, though. There is actually a park a few blocks from here which would translate into the hops garden. I don't know if it comes from there. So there is clearly a willingness to pay for products like these in certain income levels. Much of the so-called locally produced food in Sweden falls under this category, I would say, where there is a real willingness to pay from a real person. You can criticize this for being elitist or just make fun of it or just mock it, as many people do. But I mean, it's a part of a free market, and I think you will categorize this as unproblematic. So my main impression is that the food debate in Sweden is not as concentrating on local eating as the American and the Canadian debate has tended to become, at least not yet. Instead, we are still very much focused on the concepts of health and climate. Both these trends put meat very much in the center of the food debate right now. There has been discussions of a meat tax for climate reason or even for health reasons. The climate footprint, of course, of meat. Animal welfare, often linked to the country of origin. Of course, you can sometimes hear protectionist arguments about Swedish meat or Swedish products that I don't like. But if I should step inside to the shoes of the Swedish farmers lobby, it's actually fair to say that the animal welfare regulations in Sweden, in many respects, not in all, but in many respects, are stricter than in many other countries. So it's fair to say that. The Swedish farmer lobby has even made this smartphone app. It's an app for smartphone where you scan the barcode where you're actually in the grocery store and can instantly see if the main ingredients is of Swedish origin or not. If it is considered Swedish by the Swedish farmer lobby, that is, you get a happy green thumb up. If not, you get this passive-aggressive red thumb down. So this is like protectionism without tariffs, or I don't know what to call it. Another example of ways to try to make consumers aware of the country of origin, because Sweden being a small country, local is Swedish, really much is the same, is this sausage. On the label on the back side, you can read this, my free translation. This sausage contains only Swedish hand-cut pork. All the ingredients in our sausage are made in Sweden by Swedish workers with collective agreements. Employer contributions, taxes are paid on behalf of the Swedish welfare state. Swedish jobs contribute to Swedish welfare. And this is obviously measures taken to control the import of food. But as I said earlier, we just don't import food. We're also a reasonably big food exporter. We consider ourselves often to be a nation of engineers, and the mining industry, the forestry industry, and the car industry has been like at the heart of Swedish exports. But now we actually export more food than pharmaceuticals and more food than cars. And this is a factor that I think you can discuss even more in your book, that food trade, you talked about the social capital. I have an example of social capital when it comes to food trade. Take, for example, the middle example, the export of Swedish pig feet to West Africa. We don't consume a lot of pig feet ourselves in Sweden. I mean, 1 or 2 at Christmas, that's it. So earlier, they were just destroyed, or nothing happened to them. But in the 60s, a man in the southern Swedish town of Kalmar met an exchange student from Senegal, who told him that pig feet is considered a delicacy in West Africa. So this guy started to buy the feet from Swedish slaughterhouses, who that got money for the feet instead of paying to get rid of them, and are do still today. And the feet are put in brine, that is salt in water, so they have a very long shelf life, even in room temperature or the Senegalese climate. So actually, Swedish pig feet is such a big brand in some countries in West Africa that there are private copies of Swedish pig feet on the market going around. Then, of course, Absolut Vodka is our by far biggest export product. It stands alone for 10% of Swedish food exports. And ironically, Absolut Vodka was made a commercial success by the then state-owned company Vin och Sprit. So much for yeah. And in southern Sweden, the climate and the soil makes a perfect terroir for pea growing. Actually, half of the Swedish pea harvest is exported to Italy. And my last point deals with the fact that food isn't like any other good. I know that sounds very much like Michael Pollan or one of the other gurus, and sometimes you seem to imply in your book that food is like any other good. Maybe I'm building up a straw man here. I'm not sure, but actually I think Michael Pollan has a very good point in stating that there is no other good that we buy several times a week and making a part of our own body. I mean, we hardly have that kind of intimacy with our own spouses. So no wonder we have a rather neurotic relationship with food. You said that you have looking at the facts and not what you feel about food. Well, it's also a fact that we feel about food, and we will continue to feel about food. And this really makes food unique. But it doesn't lead me or us to the conclusion that food should be included in free trade like any other products. On the contrary, it makes it even more important that food is part of the free trade chain. And I think these pictures show that. I think that part of the locavorial trend, or whatever you call it, is simply a great curiosity about where the food is from. Not necessarily that the food must come from nearby. It's important, and I think you could make that even clearer. It's important not to mix up what's actually a growing interest in food, which I like, and even maybe a growing willingness to pay for food, which I, as a representative for a special interest, adore, of course. And on the other hand, an ideologically fueled will to alter the global food system. I'm not sure that these trends and all these pictures you showed is really about that. Maybe it's not that ideological. I will continue to be a friend of both free trade and market principles, and still acknowledge the fact that food is unique and interest in food is good. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Could I just ask you one very short question?
Yes.
As a representative for the Swedish food producing industry, don't you think that Swedish food is a little bit better than the others?
Of course it is.
Yeah.
I can give you a lot of arguments why it is. At least Swedish produced food is.
Okay. Yeah, just wanted to know. Time is running, so I will let Linus Kjellander, who come from dyraremat.nu, comment. And I don't know if you have a presentation. No?
No,
Yep.
I don't.
Okay.
Hello, everybody. I'm Linus. Nice to be invited here. It might not be too obvious why I'm here. I was just asked before the weekend if I could come here, and I guess I don't know why it was that difficult to find someone to pick up our point of view. I'm not a researcher. I want to start by saying that, but I'm going to talk a bit about the research the book is claiming to investigate. Let me see where to start. I must start by saying, so I will comment on the book, and I'm going to do it from the perspective of Dyrare Mat Nu, Pay the Price, which is the organization I'm representing. We're not only a Swedish movement, we're active in 3 or 4 countries at the moment. Our aim is not to only lobby for higher food prices and not for locally produced food. It's the aim is to find a system where you can actually produce food in a sustainable way for soon to be 9 billion people on this earth. So we don't say that we have all the answers, but we think we're asking the important questions at least. And I must say this book is a quite honest attempt to give what I would say a kind of personal conviction to prove the logic of the market economy on the food production market and the food market. And I guess that's where our worlds a bit collide. I think that's, at my personal belief, I think that's the wrong way to enter the discussion about food production. You have the means before you have the goals, so to speak. It's not written by ecologists or environmental research. I give you that, so I won't be too hard on your facts. But I think actually it is a problem to not to, well, you actually say yourselves that the food system is a complex system and that you have your personal view on that, but you are not really saying what you're not saying, and that's a problem. So I would like to just say some words about what I think you could have told us. Let's start with what I would say is the misconception of local food. I'm going to go back then to the backside of the industrial food production, and I'm going to end with a small reference with an interview with my father that I made today. And let me also say that if you ask me personally, I'm not a local food promoter. I think there are, as you really well put, there are reasons why we should actually debate this issue. So what's the definition of a local, the local locavore agenda that you assume in your book? On many places in the book, you use the word organic, local, and traditional in the same sentence. And actually, that's a question I would like to ask you, and I hope you can comment on that later, why you do this. Because, and I want to give you an example, and this is retranslated into English, of course. So you say, when the food is produced organic and locally, they wish for a lifestyle that today can only be found in the most poor places on earth. So what's the problem with a comment like a quote like this? Besides the obvious reason that locally produced food is not organic most of the times, it's conventional and it's most of the times large scale, but it's close to where the consumer is. That must be some kind of core of the local food concept. Secondly, this quote actually shows something about your knowledge in farming techniques. Organic is not the same as traditional food production. It's actually the other way around. The organic, and in my point of view, the organic production would be the most developed technique in food production, where you actually can use the methods and means of of nature to produce food, and not only by technical means. And of course, yes, the traditional methods does not have too much in common with organic farming. So what's the problem with industrial farming then? So to start with, even though you're saying that this way of producing food is the way to eradicate poverty and starvation, even though we have had these production methods for quite some years now, we still have 1 billion people starving on Earth. And that number is growing. It's not decreasing. And that's to start with. Then we also have the decrease in biodiversity and ecosystem services, which in the long run gonna cause, well, you know about the climate change, but you also know about the decrease in human welfare on a global scale, also in our countries. We have the health problems, both for farm workers and also for consumers, that's caused by the pesticides used in the industrial farming. You have the total dependence on limited resources, and that's the fossil resources, energy and phosphorus, which is actually you're mentioning the peak oil, but you don't mention the peak phosphorus, which is actually even worse. And then you have the land grabbing issue with rich countries buying land in poorer parts of the world. Yeah, that's just a few points. So what about the interview with my dad? He lives outside of Katrineholm. It's about 2 hours south of Stockholm. It's a small farm. He grows vegetables, he has some animals, and he has some grain as well. It's organic, of course. It's been organic for as long as he's been a farmer. He's been it for 35 years. He has a large diversity with all producing all the food for the animals on the farm and everything. And organic, maybe you have a point in the context of I think you make the point in this concept of US about organic. It's not controlled, and you have so many distrusts within that sector. Well, I wouldn't say that's the case in Sweden. We have both strongly controlled farmers, producers. We have very strict, the most organic farmers in Sweden are even stricter than the organic concept of the EU. When it comes to the animals, you often, in a couple of times in the book, you mention Denmark is a good example of how they lowered the prices of pig meat. The backside of that, you don't actually even mention the word animal welfare in the book. The only time you mention it is when you have a footnote where you say it's so the poor animals has to be outside in bad weather. And I think that's a problem, because the reason why the Danish pig meat is so cheap is because of bad animal welfare. And also he sells his, my father, not the pigs, sells his produce together with other farmers, and he sells to customers in Stockholm. So he's, in that term, a local producer for customers in Stockholm. So I asked him, what's the best thing about being a farmer and doing the kind of production that you do? And his answer was the feeling of control of nature's powers. And what I think he means, there are many things within this answer. It's partly to not be dependent on someone else's resources, not to be dependent on large Monsanto and other companies producing his seeds, but also to actually the positive feeling of knowing the methods of making the earth growing something more than it would without your help. And actually, organic farming has, there has been calculations. And because I know you're going to ask me, would organic farming actually be able to sustain 9 billion peoples? And there are research saying yes, and there are research saying no. But if you look at the overconsumption of food today, and you also count that organic farming actually can improve the harvests in areas like Eastern Africa and Southern Africa, there are strong suggestions that organic production could feed the world. So that said, I still agree with quite a few things in your book. I think there is a problem with the subsidies. I think the way to develop underdeveloped areas of food production is by building markets, building international markets, but also strengthening the local markets so that you can not only sell to the villagers in your village, but also sell to the cities and neighboring cities. But if I would have given you a suggestion before you wrote this book, I would have asked you to actually ask to first count in the complexity of nature when you write this book. Sustainability is not only increasing economic output, it's also to be able to sustain the ecosystems that's on the planet. But then again, you say in your book that, well, let's just go out with a bang. So, meaning that you see that there are limits in nature's resources, but let's just use them while we're on this planet. I would have liked a discussion where you actually take in the limited resources and where you can, and if you would do that, I think you would have another conclusion. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. And please stay here, and I'm going to ask all the speakers to come up.
Okay.
Hiroko, you want to join us as well?
Yeah, she's actually she's read virtually all the studies that says that organic can feed the world, so she's the real expert on that between us. So.
And I just have to tell you before Lydia kills me here that there is actually a hashtag for this event. I forgot that each time I went up here, so it's hipsters dilemma. Sorry, it's a bit late for that, but it's very interesting. And maybe you would like to start to comment on the comments you've got for your book.
I'm afraid you've taken a few quotes out of context there. The point we make in the book about sub-Saharan African or South Asian peasants is that if you're looking for the real locavores in the world, don't look for hipsters in, what's the name of that neighborhood? The Horns? Ushtul. No, the real locavores are subsistence farmer who live like more than 50 kilometers away from an all-weather road, who produce most of their food, who trade with their neighbors. And then they are the 1 billion malnourished people in the world, and they're malnourished because they're not part of the global division of agricultural labor. And you could see, yes, today 1 people out of 7 are malnourished. What a tragedy. And of course it is, and we're certainly not denying that. But then look at the statistics in the 1950s. There were a lot less people than today, And the early 1950s is really where modern agriculture comes of age. Tractors become more abundant, synthetic nitrogen fertilizer. And the statistics you have at the time is that 1 out of 2.5 people in the world is malnourished. So we've made a lot of progress. It's not perfect, but the progress that has been made is with modern production technologies. Now, I will grant you I'm not familiar with the Swedish organic system. Perhaps here you have random field inspection, something that you don't have in North America. Perhaps here taking manure from conventional dairy operations is not accepted. But in North America, the organic sector would not survive without taking all the excrements from conventional dairy production, whose animals take antibiotics and are treated in confined environments and barely ever go out these days. But in North America, this is organic. So that's the problem. I mean, organic means different things to different people. And when you say we go out with a bang, we said, well, if you believe in finite resources like you do, then you cannot believe in sustainable development because all you do is delay the unavoidable. If you don't believe that human ingenuity will be able to find ways around scarcities by developing ever newer and better ways to do more with less, you know, your electronic device today is not cheaper because somebody was exploited, but because we developed better ways of transmitting and accessing information than 50 or 60 years ago. If you believe that resources are finite, then you cannot believe in sustainable development. The world will collapse. So that's why we said, if you don't believe that the human brains will find a way around scarcity, we might as well go out with a bang, because then sustainable development is unthinkable. Anyway, these are the main points I wanted to make. I don't know if you...
Hiroko, do you want to comment before I'll get Linus? Sorry, I give you the mic. Yeah, we only have a few mics.
I have a couple of comments about some organics. If developing country, people would like to pay more, why organics share of the market is still 2% of the U.S. Should be more. Also, organic needs more input. As I said, we have to, need more land and deforestation and blah blah blah. So, organic market is pretty much limited. So it's the evidence of organic is not, kind of sustainable, as people believe. It's very controversial, but I'm gonna put in a way. Also, animal welfare, but it's not perfect. Of course, we have to improve that one. But in the end, we have to still kill the animal. That's the reality. And hopefully, in the future, we can, cultivate the meat from, kind of dish. It's the ideal situation, but we are a bit far from that. So in the future, we hope we can cultivate the meat from the dish. Also, Kobe beef, as you may know, in Japan, it's the luckiest cattle in the world. They have beer, Mozart music, and massages. But it's very expensive. 1 kilogram is about $200 US. It's the only thing we can make in Japan because we don't have resources to grow cattle in a cheap way. So we have to be creative to have highest value added cattle in the world. So in the United States, we are now have Kobe beef level. It's very marble one, but I don't want to be hypocritical, but we have to kill the animal in the end. So also, a couple of things is you said land grabbing, or rich country buying some land in the poor country, or people are having starvation, 1 billion people starving. It's more political problems rather than some production itself. So sometimes people mixed up with political issues, with production, agricultural productions, but you have to differentiate the cause of the problems.
Okay, I'm going to let Linus comment on this, and then we'll open the floor for a few questions. I know we're running a bit late here, but please stay if you want to hear the end.
There is one sustainable energy resource that you might know about, and that's the sun. And that's the only energy resource that's actual. And taking that into account, you can have ideas about sustainable development and still trying to preserve the fossil fuels. And And that's what actually driving the organic farming. It's not the fossil fuels, it's the sun. I say again that traditional production in Eastern Africa is not organic. It's traditional. They are not using the farming techniques that would increase the harvest. But what you actually say, if I listen to you, is that we should buy Swedish. If we are proud of our higher animal welfare standards and our organic certifications, you actually say that we should support our Swedish farmers. And I'm happy to hear that, of course. Well, it's almost a bit silly to argue that, well, if you kill the animal, you don't have to take care of its life. It's I won't go into that.
Do we have any questions from the audience? Anybody would like to? Yes, somebody?
You want to send the mic
Yeah, I
in the
think
back
we have
maybe?
to send the microphone down because we're recording this. Okay, we take both and then you can answer.
Sure.
Yeah.
Hello, my name is Valdemar Ingdahl, and I have a question of about developing agriculture. And I was thinking about GMOs, a big no-no here in Europe, but actually, if you think of it, it's, after all, it could be sustainable, it could be produced organically, and it could produce the yields in order to produce more locally, because you have higher yields, you can control the crops, etc. So maybe the solution of the hipsters dilemma is GMOs.
Interesting question.
Okay.
Very interesting. I think
I have to say that
Yeah.
I borrowed this from Professor Pamela Ronald at UC Davis with her husband Roel Adamczak.
we take one more question and then we let you answer. So please
Thanks.
remember this. Yeah.
Basically, the point I want to make is something that Pierre addressed in the beginning, and that's that this issue isn't really about food. It's about denying the market as an effective means of allocating resources, which we've very much seen when we've listened to the last speaker. Because I think that's basically the real issue. If you're gonna say, yeah, this is what the market does, but it's not enough, then, I mean, then we're actually talking about different things. Because I would say my solution to animal welfare is, if people are willing to pay for it, if they're really upset, then that's not a problem. It's incoherent to say, yeah, they're upset, and therefore we have to regulate it away. That's nonsense. But that's the leftist arguments you hear. So you're actually discussing different issues. And obviously, it's pretty obvious what side I'm on. But I think that's the main problem with the argument, because you're saying what's efficient, and there's the leftist argument is more of a moralistic one. So I think that's the main
Do you
issue,
have a
basically.
specific question, or was it more of a comment?
No. I mean, I just want you to
Yeah.
to further address that because you started off by saying that it's not really about food, and then you didn't come back to that. And I think that is the central point.
Okay.
So if you would comment more on
Sure.
that, I think that would be
Can
interesting.
I go quickly?
Yeah,
Well, again,
yeah.
I've already stated that, but the book is really an attempt to put some truth in advertising. So yes, if you want to pay more for animals that are treated in a way which you believe will be more sustainable or more humane, then so be it. But in the United States, for example, I don't know how many of you are familiar with farrow crates for pigs. I mean, they're basically containing the mother when she has her little piglets so that she cannot move over, and that's to prevent two things, that she does not eat some of them and that she doesn't crush them when she rolls over. But a lot of people say that this is not a nice way to treat Mama Piggy. Or Miss Piggy, yeah, Mama Piggy, not Miss Piggy. So, you know, but if you believe, if this is what you believe and you're willing to pay a premium for that, then so be it. We don't have a problem, but we would like people to be honest about that. The problem, if I may get back quickly to organic, and then I will address GMOs, is that in the United States, the organic movement would be impossible, again, without the manure from dairy farms, which are produced, which ultimately can be traced back to synthetic nitrogen fertilizers used to grow the crops, to feed the animals, who are then given antibiotics to make sure that they're not as sick and that they're more productive than they are. And I will have to disagree with you. I will ask you to clarify what is organic, because organic in the United States is not regulated by a scientific body. There's no scientific definition for organic. It's a market. It's regulated by people who are in marketing. Organic is what it isn't. It's not is something. And I will disagree with you. I will argue that the peasants in Africa who don't have access to modern technology are de facto organics. And the reason why they don't adopt organic method is that they don't have this abundance of conventional cow manure, among other things, to adopt methods which are used in North America, which can only be traced back to modern production technology. Now, in terms of GMO, well, it's just a way to produce better varieties. You know, this morning I had ruby red grapefruit at my hotel. How many people know how ruby red grapefruit was created? I'm going to use an image here, but basically a few decades ago, people took grapefruit seeds, threw them in a nuclear reactor, and so what happened? And some of them came out, and you know what? The grapefruit was red. And that's how the thing was created. How is GMO worse than that? I'm just saying. I don't know if you want to add something.
Fredrik has also signaled that he would like to comment on the questions.
Just one short thing about animal welfare. I'm thinking you're making it a little bit easier for yourself. You're saying that the people who were like pro-animal welfare were leftist. I think it's a much more complex issue than that. For example, I'm happy with the Swedish quite strict animal welfare rules. As it comes to GMO, I think the food industry, you're right. The food industry has partly itself to blame for that. If somebody studies marketing and would like to do a case study in like the worst introduction ever made of a product to a market, they should do it on GMO. It's really sad to see, because the food industry has been very good in explaining why GMO is good for the industry, not for the consumers. And I think that's a pity. There's a big gap between the European and the American situation, but of course GMO is part of the solution, not the problem.
Linus, you want to comment as well on these issues? Especially, I'm very curious about your standpoint on the GMO issue, whether that would be easier actually to have more organic growing if you had more GMOs.
Well, let me just first comment on the animal welfare. I just wish you won't have the same idea about human welfare, and that you actually don't want to push the standards of productions to a level where you have human life as at the same view on human life as on animal life. Sorry? Well, it's the same consequence on the price that you pay on the product. GMO, it is complex with GMO, and I'm the first to admit that. What you have to take into account, if you're a supporter of industrial production, GMO it's logical, it's good. But if you're instead promoting a small-scale production where the farmer owns his own resources, then GMO is not an option. And I believe that we on a global scale going to have both. I think if you add everything up, you're going to have those that don't value both producers and customers that don't value that farmers own their own production means. But you're going to have also those that value strong local communities where farmers also are independent on others.
Okay, we're gonna see if there is one or two more questions in the audience. Are there? Yes, there is one at least. And then we're gonna give you final round answering these questions.
Hi, so I spent 3 years in the United States recently, and they're probably the best people in the world politicizing questions. And as with this question, as with many others in that country, this is kind of become a right-left question, where the right are generally skeptical towards organic growing of organic foods, and the left generally very appreciative of it. And an argument I heard put forward, I don't agree with it, but I thought was fairly compelling, was by a Democratic friend of mine, so the Democratic Party in the United States, and he told me that one of the reasons for supporting organic and locally produced food is that if we buy locally produced food at a premium, which we can afford, then people in developing countries that cannot afford to pay a premium can buy the food that we then import for a lower price and thus feed them. And I was wondering if you have any comments on that. Like, my theory was that maybe they will grow something else, but I didn't really have any data to back it up. So if any comments on that would be very appreciated.
I think it is very short-sighted.
Sorry, I think we'll just take one more question and then you can comment in the final round.
apologize.
Okay?
Hello, Hanna Björklund is my name. I grew up on a farm myself, so I think this is very interesting because I'm very interested in like cropping and animal care and stuff like that. I think the main problem with this argument that if people want to pay for animal welfare, they can do that, and if they don't want to do it, they don't need to. But the problem is that Swedish farmers don't have a choice. I mean, if I don't treat my animals after certain standards, I can be put to jail. So I don't have a choice to produce the cheaper food by treating my animals worse than the farmers in Denmark does. So I think that's the main problem. I think if Swedish consumers don't want to pay the price for animals treated better, then the Swedish farmers shouldn't have to pay the price for that either. Then there should be the possibility to have a diversity for the farmer and the producer as well, if we give the consumer the possibility to have the diversity to buy meat that is cheaper, but with the animals treated worse. So I just think for the farmer's point of view, it's hard to you have to be the savior and you have to have this very expensive kind of production if the consumer and the government doesn't want to pay for that, but they still want to treat you bad if you doesn't follow it. So it's a little bit hard, I think.
Okay, thank you. I think we're going to end up with you answering these questions and also giving your final comments. And maybe we can start with, and let the authors comment on the end.
Sure, okay.
So I'll start.
Yeah.
When it comes to animal welfare, I say I'm very much pro the legislation that we have in Sweden. If I say something about farmers, farmers in Sweden tend to say the argument you just did, that we have to pay the price for the higher Swedish animal welfare. That is true. Farmers in Denmark, which you compare to, if you ask a farmer in Denmark, they will say, we have much higher land prices than farmers in Sweden do. That is also true. Farmers in the Netherlands, they have a special house tax that they have to pay. So the costs are different in all sorts of places. As opposed to you, I mean, I haven't seen any system that is credible in how to feed all the world's people without industrial production of food. I think that is not a realistic way to view things. But on the other hand, I don't think that the locavorian trend, as it looks like in Sweden at least, is a threat towards the global food system. Neither is the 3 or 4% of the Swedish food cells that is organic. As I see today, that's maybe as you were saying, to politicize the debate a little bit too much. Thanks.
Linus, final comment.
If you do believe that there are limited resources, the only way to go into a sustainable production is to develop a production where you're not dependent on fossil fuels and phosphorus as well. So we don't really have a choice whether to go into organic or not. If you call it organic or not, that's not important to me. But we do have to develop organic or production methods that's sustainable. Just one word about protectionism. There has been that word has been mentioned pretty many times, and of course there is some good examples of protectionist acts where you, by political means, support local food. But as my final word, I think as long as people buy it, sell it. There is a market, and quite a few people actually value the higher standards of production in Sweden. Many consumers don't know about it. They don't know about the difference about the Swedish pig and the Danish pig, which is a problem, and therefore it's very important that we have organizations like the Swedish Farmers Association to inform. And that's not protectionism, it's marketing. And it's the same marketing as the industrial production farmers are doing.
Pierre and Hiroko, I want to give you the last word as well. And also, it would be interesting to hear, is this debate the same as when you present your book in Canada? Or what do you say about the Swedish debate? If you could take that in the end.
Okay. You'll take it. Okay. Yeah, no, it's funny. The one thing that I keep hearing about local food is that, local soil is unique in as much as it's always better wherever you live than in the country next door or the province next door or something. So in a way, this is very common. In Quebec, we have the same argument all the time. Well, in Quebec, we take care of our cows and our milk is high quality. You go across the border in the United States, you don't know what kind of growth hormones they use and what they feed their animals and, those big confined feeding lots. But the ironic thing is that, I guess, Quebecers are like Swedish, let's face it, our weather is pretty harsh. A lot of people like to escape it every year. So they go to Maine in the summer, along the Atlantic coast, in Florida in the winter. They consume milk there all the time. It's not green. There's not a little forehead growing in their arm. And they're perfectly happy to eat it. And then they come back to Quebec and farmers come up with horror stories of how horrible things are in the country next door. So it's very similar in that respect. I'll be honest, I know nothing about the Danish versus Swedish standard. Perhaps it's true, but it's a very common argument. Local food activists always think that they're better than others. I'm sorry, I'm just, this is just an observation. This is not a comment. Regarding animal welfare, what I will say here, again, I grew up in the countryside. I don't pretend that my parents were full-time farmers. They were not. But I've never really met a farmer who really likes to torture his animal. You don't really get good quality meat that way. I don't know. Maybe Hiroko can comment on that. Peak phosphorus, we don't address it in the book, but there's a Canadian academic who we both like a lot. His name is Vaclav Smil, S-M-I-L. Perhaps we could send you the link, who I think completely debunks the notion of peak phosphorus. We're looking at the recent data. And finally, this idea that, well, the US should specialize in less productive agriculture that will appear to hipsters and stuff, and leave less advanced economies growing more productive food. I'm sorry, but you need to grow the food somewhere. If you grow organic, then you take the best land out of conventional production, and you will produce less food. Humanity tried organic for 10,000 years, and we were pretty much starving and really bad for a long time. Humanity's standard of living and the conquest of malnutrition really began with the advent of modern farming technology. This required a lot of work. It required a lot of thinking, a lot of new ways of doing things. And what we suggest in the book is that thing happens for a reason. Yes, they're distorted by subsidies and trade barriers, but before wishing to undo our present system, perhaps we should make a better effort of understanding why it emerged in the first place.
It's also in Japan, it's strange, not strange, but we don't have land to grow food. So 70% of calories coming from outside the country. So we do what we are good at, like manufacturers and cars and Nintendo, Sony's, and earn money and buy food from outside the country. And we buy, Danish blueberries, and we buy king crab from Canada. So I cannot find king crab in Canada, but we can find in Tokyo the king crab. That's the reality of globalization. And in Japan, we don't have much locavores movement because we know we cannot afford to talk about buy local, it's only local. So I would say, if you like to, we are not denying anything, we pay for it and feel good, it's good. But in Japanese context, I think it's locavore movement is hipsters luxury. I'm gonna put it in that way, so.
Okay, thank you very much, everybody. Give a big hand to the... Thank you. And And thank you very much, all of you, for coming here. Actually, the mingling, no, not the mingling, minglet will continue outside. And I'm sure you will have the authors
yes.
here and maybe the others.
Yeah, we're happy
so
to
you
sign
could
books
talk.
if you have any
Yeah.
interest.
Yeah. Thank you very much.